very skeptical of a priori metaphysics. Often I can't see what the project is, why anyone would think it's interesting, and also why anyone would think that our a priori metaphysical intuitions, have any evidential weight. So yeah, I've never been part of the metaphysics industry, at least that sort of metaphysics industry. As I've got older and grumpier, I've become increasingly intolerant of it.
Welcome everyone to today's AMA, where we're pleased to have Tim Sterelny. He is Professor of Philosophy in the Research School of Social Science at Australian National University and Victoria University of Wellington. His primary research interests include the philosophy of language, the philosophy of biology, the philosophy of mind, and the various intersections of these domains. His books include Language and Reality and numerous published papers along with other books. Feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome Professor Sterelny.
Thank you.
All right, wonderful. So we're going to dive in with a couple of our preliminary questions. And one of them was, what are your thoughts on functionalism and panpsychism? So we're starting out with a very trivial one, but yeah, please go ahead.
Well, I'm extremely skeptical, to put it mildly, about panpsychism. Functionalism, I guess I think functionalism is probably the best sort of current physicalist approach to the mind and cognition. There are lots of different versions of functionalism, of course, and the sort of early versions, which compared to minds to sort of computers, were undoubtedly much too simple in all sorts of ways. But yeah, I'm broadly sympathetic to the functionalist approach to the mind. That having said that, I have to admit I haven't sort of seriously worked in kind of orthodox philosophy of mind, for the best part of 20 years.
All right, wonderful. So there is a couple of other questions, but before going into continuing with the biology thing, there was a brief question about your stance on the philosophy of religion. What is the view you subscribe to, specifically theism, atheism, and why?
Sorry, what was the third one?
Oh,
Theism, atheism, and
or was the question?
Oh, why? Sorry. Okay. So I'm an atheist. I'm an atheist because I find the positive arguments for theism more or less literally incredible. And so I don't see any intellectual merit in theism, and it's the kind of doctrine that would require extraordinarily impressive evidence, to buy into it. I mean, after all, it's a extraordinary hypothesis that something like the universe, was created, by an eternal intelligent being. So that's the kind of hypothesis that extraordinary evidence to buy into it, and I don't see any evidence at all, let alone the kind of extraordinary evidence that you would require to buy into a hypothesis like that. So yeah, I'm fairly clearly and unequivocally in the atheist camp. That's a sort of an intellectual story. I mean, I think it's also fair to your audience, can make of this what they will. As just a piece of personal biography, I find it extremely difficult to imagine what it's like to be a theist. I've been an atheist all my life. My first philosophical thought, insofar as I ever had any philosophical thoughts, were listening to a scripture in primary school, wondering why on earth anyone would believe anything have a long history, of personal history of atheism, and almost certainly part of the reason why I'm an atheist is this sort of psychological rather than intellectual fact. But I also think that the intellectual facts support my view.
All right, wonderful. Those of you who DM me about getting on mic, just either ping me or DM me again. So, yeah, the true one too. It's slightly a follow-up question about your comments on the philosophy of mind earlier. So, the true says, I assume that you have a broadly naturalist view of the world, including the mind. Do you have a specific view in the philosophy of mind that you would endorse, like maybe some sort of identity theory?
I have been attracted to a kind of hybrid theory, but whether or not I'm attracted enough to absolutely endorse it, I'm not sure. But here's the hybrid theory. So for cognitive states, I'm inclined to accept some version of sort of representational functionalism. For qualitative states, experiential states, somewhat attracted to some version or other of an identity theory. So the standard kinds of arguments for functionalism, multiple realizability arguments, arguments about the different neural and physical organization of actual and possible other organisms get quite a lot of bite, I think, when you're thinking about cognitive states. They're less persuasive when one's thinking about qualitative states. So I have some inclination towards a hybrid view of that kind. Whether or not that would work when you really leaned on it, I'm not sure, because the big problem for a hybrid theory of that kind is that there are states which seem to have both cognitive and qualitative aspects, and whether or not one could tell a coherent story of the kind that I just mentioned, for states of that kind, I'm not sure.
All right, wonderful. So, a question from Dog. He would like to know your stance on content externalism.
I used to be an absolute signed up content externalist. The only reason why I'm not still counting myself as an absolute signed up content externalist is, well, in part because I actually haven't thought about those issues in a genuinely serious way for probably 10 years. And secondly, I'm starting to worry a bit, about whether or not claims about mental content and about the content, of public representations are quite as determinately true or false as I once simply assumed. So I used to assume, buying into the standard Putnam kinds of stories, it was absolutely clear, that water in my mouth meant the watery stuff around here. I'm more worried these days than I was about whether those claims rest too much on philosophers' intuitions. And we've got good reason to suspect that philosophers' intuitions, aren't really reliable guides to the truth.
Oh, that's wonderful. So, a couple of other questions. Let's see. Okay. Do you find that the language of thought hypothesis as well as representationalism to be plausible views in mind?
Again, that's something on which my mind gone from being pretty close to a true believer to someone who's more agnostic. So when I first read Jerry Fodor's The Language of Thought, I was blown away. I thought it was, and I still think it is, one of the kind of great classics of naturalistic philosophy. And apart from his, he calls it himself, his mad dog nativism, it struck me as incredibly persuasive. I guess in the last 10 to 15 years, as models of how cognition work have gradually, been developed. So there now seem to be, for example, in the predictive coding literature and so on, some genuinely credible alternative cognitive models. I've shifted from being a true believer to being more convinced that the mind is a representational engine of some kind, but how it's internally organized, what the format of those internal representations are, questions like that now strike me as much more open, and I now think it's very likely indeed that there won't be a single answer to questions like that. So Jerry, in The Language of Thought, argued, for that the language, something like a language of thought underpins just about all cognitive processes. My guess is there's going to turn out to be that there's quite a heterogeneous array of representational forms, underlying human representational processes and cognitive processes, and the cognitive processes of non-human animals as well.
I see. So, a couple of questions. Again, I think we're back to some kind of metaphysics, but yeah. Your views on teleology and in general the purpose of life. Do you believe that there is such a thing as a purpose of life? And how do you view teleology when you speak about it?
I don't think there's a purpose of life. I think life just happens.
I see. And what about teleology?
Well, if by teleology you mean something like the purpose of life, then I don't think there's any such thing. But there are more limited notions of teleology, and so a whole lot of people have thought that you can basically interpret teleology in terms of sort of evolutionary history. So while you can't talk about the purpose of life, you can talk about the purpose of language, or you can talk about the purpose of eyes, or you can talk about the purpose of, the organization of the human pelvis for bipedal locomotion. In that sense of teleology, I'm happy to buy into teleology and explain it through evolutionary history and selection-like mechanisms. But that doesn't give you the purpose of life. That gives you the purpose of organisms and organism systems.
Okay. So the follow-up.
I just wanted to.
Okay, I wasn't reading your question, dog. Stop it. Now, so the follow-up to that was, does this view in any way influence your life? Do you find the view that there is no purpose to life as in some form of to be pessimistic? And if not, why not?
No, I don't find it pessimistic. I find the thought that we make it, that we're in a certain sort of sense open to make our life how we want to make it, if anything, liberating. So no, I don't get depressed by the thought that there's not a grand plan that I am part of. I don't think I want to be a part of a grand plan because it wouldn't be my grand plan. It would be some other bugger's grand plan, the grand plan of the universe or the grand plan of God or whatever. And I'm very happy not to be part of anything's grand plan.
All right, wonderful. So I think Dog has a slightly related question.
Yeah, my question was regarding teleology. So do you think that like we could talk about traits in terms of functions, like the function of your arm or the function of your eye, whereby function means something more than simply, like some capacity or what it does, but something that was selected for, right? So like if your eyes don't work, then they're not fulfilling their function. It's not merely that they lack a capacity.
Yeah, no, I'm happy with that way of thinking. You know, my first PhD student was Karen Leander, and she's quite famous for defending that notion of function.
Yeah, and I also had a slightly like a different question. Do you agree with because before we were talking about content externalism, do you agree with Frege's argument for the existence of propositions? And do you think that all proposition talk is dispensable insofar as we don't need it? We don't need it to explain how we can communicate shared beliefs and so on.
Yeah, I think it is dispensable. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't think there's anything you can do with propositions that you can't do when you're talking about sentences, utterances, you know, physical representation tokens of one kind and another.
And I found I had a last question, and I think another person actually also is going to ask a similar question. Do you think that things like volitional states or like commitments to act, do you think that those are normative? So, for example, if I have a volitional state whereby I want to like grab a brick, you know, is that going to be normative?
I don't think so. I don't see a reason for thinking that as normative. So no, I would I think that's sort of using normative in too broad and promiscuous a way.
Yeah.
You know, for the notion of norm, you know, to have any kind of real force, you know, or use.
But
if everything's normative, nothing's normative.
But do you think that there's going to be some volitional state is going to be imperative, right? It's going to involve some imperative, something that gives me reason to act in some, like, let's say, like a hypothetical norm, right?
Well, a hypothetical norm, I presume, gives you a reason to act, but only if a certain condition is satisfied, isn't it? If we're talking about if your understanding of hypothetical norm is the same as my understanding of a hypothetical norm, you know, so it's a potential reason to act, you know. So if the hypothetical norm is a norm like you know, leave the building, you know, if the fire alarm goes off, then you know, if the fire alarm goes off, is not going off, you've got no reason to leave the building. But perhaps we're understanding the notion of a hypothetical norm in a different way.
I see. And but would you say something like a volitional state? Would you say it's dispositional, or is it more than merely just like a mental disposition?
I think at least it can be more, you know, because it can be in a current state, you know. But could a volitional state be merely dispositional? Well, I think beliefs can be merely dispositional, you know, and if beliefs can be merely dispositional, you know, and you know, then I presume preferences could also be merely dispositional. I can't see a reason for treating preference differently from belief. So just as there's a difference between a kind of a belief and a current judgment, there'd be a difference between a preference and a kind of a current desire. But as beliefs can be dispositional, so can preferences. I think I would have to give up the view that beliefs could be merely dispositional if I wanted to reject the view that preferences could be merely dispositional. So I don't see how that could be other than a package deal one way or the other.
But how do you but what about when we say someone's belief is false, right? If beliefs are intentional and they could be true or false, or the propositions they're about could be true or false, how is that going to be cashed out on a merely dispositional account of beliefs or mental states?
I think it depends on sort of exactly how you're going to count a dispositional belief. But if, for example, I mean, this is far too flat-footed, for it to work as a serious analysis. But suppose, we analyse a dispositional belief as a belief that you would assent to if it was put to you. Then you would have a false dispositional belief, if you would assent to a false proposition, if it was put to you. Now, as I say, I'm not pretending that would do, as a genuine account, a genuinely dispositional account of belief, but it shows how you could have a dispositional account of belief and still make room for the notion of false belief.
I see. Thank you.
All right. So here's our second host who will guide the AMA forward for now.
Sure. Hi there. Sorry, I wasn't available to be there for the first while. But hi, Professor Sterelny. I had a question. I guess I'll jump in. Sort of on a related note about cognition. So you've written that an important step in theorizing about cognition and content is the consideration of the history, sort of a genealogy of these faculties. If I understand you correctly, you seem to be thinking that a completion of this project, i.e. the sort of consideration of that genealogy, is enough or nearly enough to have a sufficient account of those faculties themselves. First of all, is that a sort of correct assessment, or am I missing something?
I mean, obviously we can, sort of fiddle with it in various ways, but broadly speaking, it's a correct assessment. With it, and the sort of, I guess, the underlying idea is that if you can give a genealogy of a capacity, a natural history of the capacity, you've taken away, sort of any problem that the capacity is mysterious or inexplicable.
Right. I guess at first pass that seems fair enough, but how would you respond to those who might think that this is maybe too optimistic, that it could still leave some important features out? And secondly, what do you think are the nearest future prospects of this sort of project?
Okay, so obviously, until one actually can deliver a genealogy, that's detailed and empirically well supported, the possibility remains, that it can't be done. It's too optimistic to try and do that. And since I certainly wouldn't claim to have done that, and I don't suspect that anyone else would claim that they've done that, the suggestion that it's too optimistic has got to be one that's reasonably put on the table. So, if a worry of that kind can be defeated only by completing the project. While the project remains incomplete, the worry remains, at least potentially valid. Remind me of the second aspect of your question.
Sort of about how optimistic you are about the future prospects of that sort of project. Like how well do you think it's
moderately optimistic? Yeah, and look, I'm one reason for being pessimistic, of course, is that it's a project in the historical sciences, and historical sciences are always challenging, especially when the historical, when the topic of the historical sciences, is to do with behaviour and cognition, because the historical processes themselves, destroy information. So it's always got to be possible that the task of sort of reconstructing a genealogy of the mind, in ways that are not hopelessly speculative, simply can't be carried out for reasons of that kind. I mean, obviously, if you look at how I've spent the last 20 years of my life, I'm not signing up for pessimism, because I've spent a good deal of the last 20 years of my life trying to carry through aspects of this project. As I was saying on this program a few minutes ago, I've got a book on the evolution of language due out, in October. I've got a book on the sort of evolution of kind of cooperation and the ways it breaks down just out. So clearly I'm someone who thinks it's possible to do genealogies that aren't just hopelessly speculative. But it's also true, that of both of those books, there are inevitably speculative elements.
And do you think some of the work that you... Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go on.
I was just going to ask, sort of as a follow-up on that, do you think that some of the work that you and colleagues and others in the field have done is sort of a good sign for the prospects of that sort of project?
I think so, yes. I mean, I guess I'm not the right person to ask, because every parent loves their children. So how these projects are received, in the intellectual community is probably a better test than my own judgment about them. But yes, I am moderately optimistic.
And in your reply there, you mentioned a book you have coming out about the evolution of language, which I find a very interesting topic. I guess this question is sort of broad and probably something that you address in there, but a sort of central challenge in giving an evolutionary account of language is showing how you can have a more or less gradual transition from something like non-linguistic or proto-linguistic to something more like a full language that we ourselves have today. Because I think a lot of people have the intuition that, well, these languages are sort of self-contained. It's not like you can broach it in an easy way. It's not obvious how that would evolve. So I guess, what are some of your general thoughts of that these sorts of challenges and how they can be addressed?
Well, I think you're quite right, of course, that one of the serious issues is to sort of give a coherently gradualist account, and we certainly, in the book, we claim to be doing that. There are living systems that are intermediate, between the kinds of communicative capacities that great apes have, and the communicative capacities that you have in virtue of full human language. Derek Bickerton and a couple of other people, talked about proto-language, and there are living proto-language systems. So pigeons, for example, which are kind of trade lingua franca that develop when people are in contact but have no common language. There are systems of home sign that children develop when they're deaf in communities which don't have access to American sign, or I presume there's a Canadian sign language. So they invent for themselves sort of rough and ready systems that enable them to communicate with other people. These systems vary enormously in complexity and richness. Some of them are very rough and ready indeed, but some of them are extraordinarily rich. And indeed, there are a few people who've studied, the dynamics of a few of these over time, and show how their complexity increases over time. So there are actually some living models of how one might go from a relatively simple and limited communication system to something that's much closer to full human language.
So you think that these could be a sort of examples of earlier sort of stages in the development more
Not
complex signaling
exactly,
systems?
but they're existence proofs of how you can have intermediate systems. I think it would be much riskier to propose them as actual models of earlier stages, because after all, the people who use these systems are fully modern human beings. So it's always got to be possible that some of the things that they're doing with these, they can do only because they're fully modern human beings. But nonetheless, they're an existence proof. They're proof of concept of the possibility of intermediate systems. They show that it's not true that there's only either the incredibly limited kinds of communications that some animals can do, and the incredibly sophisticated, systems that modern humans have.
Right. Fair enough. But then there's also the other sort of communication systems we find in the animal kingdom and elsewhere. Do you think those are the sort of things we can look to as possible stepping stones?
For very early stages in the process, yes.
So there's still a big gap between those and the sort of full language.
There's a very big gap between, for example, the gestural systems of great apes, and even the kind of trading lingua franca and home sign systems I was talking about earlier. But yes, they do give you some information, about what a somewhat enriched system could be like. Some of the great ape language experiments help there too, where great apes with, a lot of human scaffolding develop gestural systems or other systems which are kind of much richer than the systems they have in their natural environment, but still aren't anything like as rich as a human language.
Fair enough. So do you think that, and I take it you would think that an understanding of these earlier stages and the sort of development historically would shed some light on how our linguistic practices really work today? It's sort of the same thing we were talking about before.
I think so, yes.
All right. Let's see. I had a question about, actually, you mentioned scaffolding in there. I recalled you had written some paper, I believe, talking about extended mind theories and scaffolding and sort of the boundaries of human cognition.
Yeah.
Do you think that in some sense what the boundaries of cognition is in a way arbitrary or very vague? Or
Yes, I do. One of the points of that paper was to say that deciding whether the extended mind hypothesis was true or false isn't really a very interesting project. There are related projects which are very interesting indeed. Which is how our capacities depend both on resources which are internal to our body, and resources which are external to our body, and how we can combine and use, some of those external resources in incredibly fluent ways, which, give us abilities which we otherwise wouldn't have. But deciding which of those, external resources, are actually part of our mind, it's just not a very interesting project.
I think I'm
I'm kind of skeptical about the point of trying to draw the boundary. I'm not skeptical about trying to understand, how those resources are used, why we can use some and not others, and so on and so forth. They're all good questions. But what the boundary is, I just don't think that's a very interesting question.
I think I'm inclined to agree. But on that sort of paper, when you talk about, I think a lot of people here will be familiar with extended mind theories, but what exactly is the relation between that and the scaffolding? hypothesis.
So in the paper, I said, look, if you want to buy into the extended mind, fair enough. There are some resources which, are which are more individualized, that a particular agent only has access to, and they have very reliable, and fluent use of those, of those resources. And if you want to say that they're part of your mind, then, I've got no particular objection to someone saying that. But I said that there's just a continuum of cases, from a kind of resource that only one person uses, they use it all the time, and that's individualized to them, to a case where they use it all the time, but it's not, individualized to them. It's just the standard make, that they get from the factory. Cases where, their access to it is good, but not quite as reliable. They don't have, access to it exactly whenever they want. They get fairly reliable access to it, but not perfectly reliable access to it. In parts of Australia, people's smartphone is like that. They have fairly reliable access, but if you go into the country, you start to lose connectivity and so on and so forth. And so I said, look, there's just a continuum of cases. If you want to regard, one kind of little subset of those cases, as special and draw a boundary line there, that's fine. But they're just the far end of a continuum of cases, where people use, external resources to adaptively support their behaviour.
And do you think that, what if someone were to suggest taking some of your other approaches here about looking at the sort of evolutionary history and factors involving cognition and so forth, to try to figure out what the boundaries of mind are? Or is that not going to be as applicable here as it is in other cases?
If someone wants to draw, is in love with drawing boundaries, and they can show that some external resources are highly analogous to some of the extended phenotype cases, that Dan Dennett talks about, that Richard Dawkins talks about it, that's fine by me. I actually think they're going to find it quite difficult to find cases like that. But if they can, and they want to regard that as, a good enough reason for regarding those resources as part of, a person's mind, then that's absolutely fine by me. As I say, I think they're going to struggle to find plausible cases, though.
Interesting. Fair enough. So moving on to a slightly different topic. So back in December, Noam Chomsky did an AMA in one of the other servers here. And when questioned about nativism, he said, to be a nativist is to be quasi-rational. And as I recall, I think you've been critical of nativism, or at least some nativist theses in the past. And so I guess I'll ask, well, are you still that critical? And would you agree that at least some basic nativist thesis is correct? That is, that we have at least some capacities and perhaps concepts that are biologically innate?
Well, for one thing, there's a lot of complexity about what it means to say something that's innate. So
Right.
One thing, you'd have to sort that out. It's a massively ambiguous term. I mean, sometimes it's a claim about adaptation. Sometimes it's a claim about very early appearance, in development. Sometimes it's a claim about invariance across developmental environments. So just what it is to be innate, is kind of complex, conflicted, and ambiguous. But let's suppose, we settle on something like genetically entrenched. That is to say that there are certain abilities that appear robustly over a wide array, of developmental environments, and relatively independently of environmental stimuli. I think everyone would agree that there's at least some things that's going to be true of. Whether it's going to be true of anything like as much, as what, Noam thinks is another question. But, I don't think anyone thinks that there's sort of nothing that would satisfy a description of that kind.
Fair enough. Do you think that on Noam, what do you think have been the prospects of the sort of universal grammar type theses that he has initiated?
I think the star of universal grammar has faded quite a lot in the linguistics community in the last 20 years. Now, I'm not enough of a linguist, to myself, have a kind of firm dog in this fight, but I'm certainly well in touch with the linguistics community in Australia. The linguistics community in Australia works, on a whole lot of non-Indo-European languages, Indigenous Australian languages, languages in Papua and New Guinea, which is sort of astonishingly, linguistically diverse, and the view of just about all of them that I've talked to, is that there's no account, of universal grammar that both has any real content and that can be empirically well supported. So it's either so abstract or vague that it's completely sealed off from empirical confirmation or disconfirmation, or it's disconfirmed.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I get the sense that, like, if any sort of we look for anything sort of consistent between all languages, and it seems that for a lot of things there's counterexamples to be found.
Exactly. That's the point they make.
Right. On a similar thought, do you think that there's something to the language of thought hypothesis, or like mentalese and brainies or whatever?
That came up earlier in the conversation.
Okay.
And I said that I, at one stage, was very much on board with the thought hypothesis. But as a range of alternative ways of modelling the mind have been developed over the last 20 years, I've become an agnostic. I still buy into a kind of representational theory of mind hypothesis. I think the mind is a sort of representation, using and processing engine. But I suspect that the mind processes representations in a wide array of formats, and some of those formats, won't be at all language-like.
Well, do you think things like beliefs and other intentional states require some sort of language, or can you have a sort of pre-linguistic intentionality of that sort? I guess this is
it depends whether you line up with Jerry or Dan Dennett, on what it is to be an intentional system. So if you line up with Fodor, and you think intentional psychology, is more or less, a description, of the cognitive engine of central cognition, then it looks like there'd have to be something at least somewhat language-like. There'd have to be something productive and systematic anyway. But if you agree with Dan Dennett, and to say that intentional, when you describe something as an intentional system, you're just describing its capacities, without commitment to the internal kind of cognitive mechanisms which support those capacities, then I think you can be neutral about the internal representational format. I used to line up with Jerry Fodor on this debate, and I'm afraid over the years, as I've got older, and perhaps senile, I've come to agree more and more with Dan Dennett on it. So that's part of the reason why I've become much more agnostic on that issue.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Right. And apologies if this has come up already in the conversation, but on the mind in general, I take it that you're, broadly naturalist, but do you have a specific
Yes.
view of in the theory of mind, or like functionalist? Or
Yes, it did come up earlier, and I will briefly, reprise my view. I said that I got some attraction to a kind of hybrid, between functionalism and an identity theory, with sort of functionalism being, the right story to tell about cognitive states, an identity theory about kind of qualitative states, experiential states. But I said a major problem for getting a view of that kind to work would be states which have both representational and qualitative aspects. So that I wasn't sure whether in the end a hybrid theory of that kind, could be coherently developed.
Interesting. Do you think that like things like perceptual states have a sort of intentional content?
They would be such a case where it might be difficult, to develop a hybrid model, because perceptual states do seem to have some experiential elements as well as representational elements.
Right. I mean, perhaps someone could think that you could separate those two elements and give it an
perhaps. I mean, look, I've never seriously worked in philosophy of perception. I've never even non-seriously worked in philosophy of perception. So I've never actually tried to do the job. So until one actually kind of knuckled down to it, and tried to work through the issues in detail, I just don't know whether a kind of, trying to separate out those two elements, really would work.
All right. I actually had a question about evolution, and I was wondering if you're familiar with Fodor's argument against natural selection. And I could talk about that briefly unless you're already familiar.
We did talk about it earlier. Yeah, I couldn't be more skeptical. I think, I think it was a sign of early senility in Jerry, I'm afraid.
Do you think that where he potentially goes wrong is in his characterization of natural selection as a thesis?
And basically making up metaphysical principles about science and saying that science has to conform to metaphysical principles that he pulls out of his arse, frankly.
So what sort of principles did you have in mind there?
I would have to go back and reread it, which I'm not going to do, to tell you the truth. I just thought, as I was reading it, I thought this is incredibly sad. This is a guy who's done probably some of the, and in fact has done, some of the very best work in naturalistic philosophy, where what he did was, respond to the best sciences of the mind that we had, and try to work out, okay, if that's the best, science of the mind we have, what kind of coherent, integrated story can we give about the mind? And then when he starts to talk about biology, he's kind of making it up on the grounds of a priori first principles. Exactly what he didn't do, in the language of thought and modularity of mind.
All right. And I guess just thinking about Fodor and others and about language, do you have a preferred sort of theory of semantics, like teleosemantics or something else? Or?
I used to, again, this came up a little bit earlier on, when I was asked about kind of content externalism and stuff like that. So, yeah, I'm broadly sympathetic to teleosemantic, accounts of at least perceptual states, the content of perceptual states. The problem for teleosemantics is to sort of to get the transition from representational states for which you can give, a plausible selective account, of why we have those representations, to the kind of representations that people can form, in the course, of their life or in the course of an afternoon. Now, Ruth Millikan has an incredibly complicated, way of trying to extend the notion, of teleo function, from the one case to the other. I mean, I've got to say, it just never, even though that maybe in some technical sense the definitions work, it never struck me that the theoretical motivation and the theoretical conviction, transferred, from representations for which there's a plausible selective history to representations, that are constructed by a whole lot of mechanisms for which there might be a plausible natural history. So I think the problem of naturalizing content, is still a long way from solved.
Fair enough. And we had on perception, we had a related question from HumbleQuest, who was wondering if you're at all familiar with Donald Hoffman's user interface theory of perception.
No, I'm not.
So it's
How
not,
does it go?
it's not something I'm super familiar with, but it emphasizes, as far as I understand, it emphasizes the idea that our perceptual states have evolved to sort of hide the actual complexity of the world and just give us a more basic picture of it in a way that
Right.
something analogy sometimes people give is the relationship between a desktop interface and a computer. The image on the desktop is quite a simplified version that limits a lot of the complexity that's really going on. But yeah, there's probably more to it that I'm not super familiar with. But.
Yeah. Look, I mean, and just hearing that for the first time, it doesn't sound at all implausible. There's an enormous amount of sort of information, or potential information, hitting our sensory apparatus, most of which in some sense is irrelevant to what we want to do next. So one of the tasks of the perceptual system is clearly going to have to be kind of filtering and ignoring. And so the general picture that you just sketched, sounds, broadly plausible to me. How it works in detail and so on, of course, I have no idea, having been, introduced to the idea literally in the last minute.
But do you think that these sorts of views might lead us to some skepticism, i.e., in the sense that, well, the world, so to speak, that our perceptions present to us might be, although our perceptions are useful for various things like survival and so forth, it might give us false impressions in many ways about the world in which we live. Do you have any? Think there might be some concern, sort of epistemically, about how we, whether we're really warranted in the beliefs, everyday beliefs we have about the external world, or maybe it's not at all like it seems to us.
I mean, if it's just filtering and kind of, sort of lumping, so, a whole lot of, sort of very similar, transductions are treated as identical. I don't think so. I mean, people have kind of, had kind of broadly similar worries to that about sort of whether colour is a real phenomenon, or whether, it's a sort of, in some sense, an artifact of our kind of, of how our design perceptual systems interact with the world rather than a feature of the world itself. So I guess here's the situation. We're not relying on a single sensory modality. We're not, even less, we're relying on a single sensory modality at a time. So we have kind of multiple ways of accessing, the world via our senses, and of course we can amplify, test, check all of those via a huge range of scientific instruments now. So no, I wouldn't think of this as something that's the foundation for some serious skeptical argument. I mean, it might be, foundation for an argument of not having kind of, naive realism about colour or smell, but I don't see that it would be a reason for being kind of, thinking that the external world is not remotely, how we think it is.
Fair enough. I mean, personally, I've always, on color and a lot of other so-called like secondary qualities, I've always been attracted to a kind of dispositionalist view, where, according to which, for something to be, say, green, is for it to be disposed to produce in us the phenomenal experience of a certain sort that we can identify, and then on that view, some things reflecting only wavelengths of a certain, like, I don't know, 500 nanometers is just going to be what it is, and that's the sort of thing that's disposed to produce in us that effect, and so that's the sort of thing.
I mean, I don't have a dog in the what is colour fight, but I certainly have, wouldn't see that as an unreasonable view.
Fair enough. I know HumbleQuest had an edition on the Donald Hoffman user interface theory. He adds that Hoffman actually also makes the assumption that, one, consciousness is fundamental, and two, that it can be modeled with evolutionary game theory. I guess those are potentially more controversial assumptions.
Yes, well, I don't even know what it means to say that consciousness is fundamental, and of course, maybe it can be, modeled with evolutionary game theory. Maybe it can't. I'd have to see what the exact hypothesis is, and what kind of evolutionary game theory, model it is. I mean, it doesn't look natural, for an evolutionary game theory model, because because who are the agents? There's me, the perceiver, but the world isn't, an agent. The trees aren't, agents in perceptual interaction with me. So it doesn't strike me as a natural, phenomenon for evolutionary game theory modeling. I mean, evolutionary game theory modeling, is usually, kind of much more appropriate, in cases where, agents are interacting with one another, via various modifiable strategies. And that doesn't really look like the right model of the relationship between the mind and the world in perception.
Fair enough. Yeah, I guess on fundamentality, I not so familiar with Donald Hoffman. I imagine he might go into that in more detail, but some people have in mind maybe something like mereological, and that it's like a simple in that way, or maybe that it's it's fundamental in that you can't adequately account for it in a theory which doesn't employ the sort of phenomenal or conscious terms, or maybe something else is meant. I'm not sure.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm kind of very skeptical about all of those hard problem type claims about consciousness. So don't sign me up for the view that, consciousness is fundamental.
I mean, especially if it turns out that consciousness is some sort of physical or functional state.
Yes, I think some kind of.
Yeah. So a different thing. Let me just find this question. Yeah. Edmund Campion was wondering if you believe that life has meaning. And I'll just add on to that. I had read once you said in a review something to the effect of the more contingent it is, or something is, the more fragile it is, the more precious it, and the greater our responsibility to guard and protect it. After all, there's no one upstairs to press the restart button. I guess does this reflect some of your views on the purpose of life, if there is such a thing?
I mean, I'm very skeptical about talking about the purpose of life. I mean, there was sort of a question earlier about telos, which is in the same kind of ballpark as talking about purpose of life. When people talk about the purpose of life, you can see the kind of glowing capital P in purpose. And I just don't see where that kind of conception, fits into a naturalistic worldview, and I do have a naturalistic worldview. So I don't think there's a purpose of life, in the capital P sense of purpose. There are many purposes of life, namely the ones that we choose to give it, as we live. But people who talk about the purpose of life don't normally, have that in mind when they talk about the purpose of life. So no, I'm in the grand, sort of capital P sense, I'm a purpose of life skeptic.
Fair enough. On naturalism, so I've often found myself agreeing with a lot of things that self-proclaimed naturalists say, but at the same time, I've found it difficult to come up with a sort of precise statement of what naturalism is. I mean, do you have something precise in mind, or is it sort of more of a general stance, or maybe could you sort of speak on that?
It's much more of a general stance. Yeah. No, I don't. I've never come up with a precise definition, of naturalism. I don't really see a need for a precise definition. I don't see a problem that a precise definition of naturalism would solve.
So what do you think some of the features of that general stance are?
Sorry, didn't hear that.
Sorry, on that general stance, like what do you think some of the sort of features of that stance are?
So I mean, basically trying to work out a conception of what the world is like, and what we are like, that fits into the picture of the world, that you can construct, from a synthesis, of the various sciences. I mean, I take one of the jobs of philosophy, is to sort of to integrate, the specific ideas and insights of the various sciences into an overall view, of the world, and the human place in it. And I mean, that strikes me, as broadly speaking, what the naturalist project is in philosophy.
All right, and on so as of course we've talked about naturalism and evolution, and Golf Tango Kilo is wondering if you're familiar with or have thought about Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, according to which, the likelihood that we would have generally reliable cognitive faculties given both naturalism and evolution is quite low, or so he claims, and so we should think that evolution and natural selection as a conjunction is probably not true.
I don't. Obviously I don't buy into that view, because I don't think it's true. That the probability of having reliable cognitive mechanisms, if they're evolved, is low. I've written a bit on that. Peter Godfrey Smith's, written on it originally. His book, on the function of mind in nature. So no, I don't. I think that premise is just false.
So what is the? Because I think my general thought on that is, well, there's going to be some naturalistic and evolutionary theses on which it's going to be likely or very likely that we would have reliable faculties. So why not think that one of those is going to be the one that's going to turn out to be true, and hence the conditional probability wouldn't really be that low. I mean, is that totally?
Sorry, I didn't get the beginning of that statement.
Well, that there's going to be some sort of versions of both naturalism and evolution on which a sort of more precise thesis on which there is a decent expectation that creatures like us would have reliable faculties, and so the conditional probability is just going to be false, that we wouldn't, that the likelihood of reliable faculties on those more precise theses would be low.
And I think isn't that what I said?
I think generally, maybe I just put it in different words.
Yeah. So look, I mean, I've defended a view of the evolution of cognition, which tries to explain why it is that you would expect, our cognition to be, kind of broadly reliable, given what we know, about our evolutionary history and the selective demands on cognition. So yeah, I mean, I think, so if I understood what you just said, some of my work is precisely an attempt, to specify such a model of cognitive evolution.
Right, fair enough. I think Canadian Catholic had a question that he wanted to ask. If you wanted to get on mic.
Yeah, I would love to. Thanks once again, Dr. Sterelny, for doing this Q&A. So a couple of things. First of all, you have already said that you subscribe to compatibilism, but my question was, what do you make of this tendency of a lot of people who have studied sciences like you, especially the biological sciences, like neuroscience, their tendency to completely deny the existence of free will? What do you make of that tendency? Do you think it's something irrational, or do you think that there is something to it? That would be my first question. And another of my questions is, what do you make of most many arguments that, for example, make cases for the supernatural? So such argumentation that, for example, imply that there must be something more to our brain. Specifically, your reaction to idealism. Idealism isn't an argument, it's an outlook, but I mean, what is your view? And for the non-idealists, maybe thought experiments like Mary's Room, Jackson's knowledge argument, like, what do you make of that? Thank you.
On the first part of that, I actually didn't know, as a sociological fact, that the neuroscientists are skeptical about free will. So that's news to me. And of course, given that it's news to me, I'm not going to give you a kind of sociological, diagnosis, of why there's that trend, because I didn't know there was one. On the kind of, the second more, philosophical, side of your question, Jackson's knowledge argument, I think for a long time, there have been good responses to Jackson's knowledge argument, including one by Jackson. But I mean, early on, I liked the ones by, Paul and Paddy Churchland. They said, look, we think we can imagine what it's like to be Mary, but we can't. The state of being, kind of omniscient, about the sort of, the physical processes of colour vision is just so far from our actual state that we're not actually imagining what we take ourselves to be imagining or what we're told to imagine, and we can't. We can't because we're just too far from that state. So that's one response to the knowledge argument, and one that I quite like. And I also quite like the old, one by David Lewis and someone else before David Lewis, so I've forgotten the person's name, who basically drew a distinction between knowledge how and knowledge that, and argued that what happens, to Mary when she sees colour for the first time is that she acquires kind of, more skills rather than more information. And I thought both of those, are quite, I find both of those perfectly adequate, in response to the knowledge argument, and I think they can be engineered in various ways to respond to the various relatives, of the knowledge argument that Dave Chalmers, and his various mates have assembled. Idealism, I've got nothing to say. I just don't know how or why anyone would take idealism seriously. It strikes me as complete lunacy.
I see, Dr. Sterelny. Thank you so much.
So on that, I'm sure this is somewhat related to what you were answering about, but do you think the sort of what's called the phenomenal concept strategy is plausible? That, well, she doesn't learn something new about the world. She just has new experiences and comes to use a new set of concepts to describe those experiences. But those experiences she could know about prior to leaving the room and so forth.
I think that's a version of the kind of David Lewis strategy. Once I saw that there were kind of strategies of response to the knowledge argument, and a number that looked, kind of, adequate to me, I've not really followed up in the details. So I know that there's a sort of a small cottage industry, of variants of these different responses, and I don't have any particular allegiance for or against any of the variants.
Fair enough. But I had a couple more questions, sort of metaphilosophy questions, and then we could move on to some others. But I just, at this point, how much longer are you free to stay for?
About another 10 minutes. I've got something on at 1 o'clock.
Perfect. Sounds good. Yes, of course. Right. So, yeah, a question sort of about metaphysics, just in a sort of meta sense. How seriously do you take sort of project of metaphysics, or are you kind of very skeptical of a lot of the work that's being done there, or what do you think about it in general?
Very skeptical of a priori metaphysics. Often I can't see kind of what the project is, why anyone would think it's interesting, and also why anyone would think that kind of a priori metaphysical intuitions have any evidential weight. So yeah, I've never been part of the metaphysics industry, at least that sort of metaphysics industry, and as I've got older and grumpier, I've become increasingly intolerant of it.
Fair enough. I think I largely agree. But just on philosophy in general, what do you think the sort of vision of philosophy is? What is it sort of in the business of doing, the purpose of philosophy, if you could give some general thoughts?
Well, for me, it's this project of integration that I mentioned a little while ago.
Right.
Of trying to kind of build, an integrated picture, of the world and the human place in the world, by sort of integrating, assembling, kind of, noticing gaps in, and so on, from the various natural sciences. So I think of, the main sort of project of philosophy as this sort of integrative process. But of course, it's an integrative process that does have kind of various feedback loops, and involves reflection on kind of method in the special sciences, and so on. So in some cases, it's not just sort of mining the sciences, but engaging in kind of stuff that's a little bit more kind of interactive, and even first order. But that's what I think philosophy ought to be. Unfortunately, I don't think very much of that kind of philosophy is being done. I mean, in the 1980s, I thought with the that kind of philosophy was becoming kind of front and center of philosophy in the English-speaking world. The heyday of people, like Steve Stitch and Jerry Fodor and Elliot Sober and Philip Kitcher, who are all doing kind of integrative projects, of that kind, and the idea that philosophy, was this sort of independent discipline with it, and independent kind of kind of methodology, that was sort of interested in the a priori, and the necessary, was kind of fading. But unfortunately, I was wrong. And the kind of philosophy that I'm doing, is more of a minority form of philosophy now than it was 25 years ago.
Reasonable enough. Actually, both this server and the channel is named after a passage from Wittgenstein that echoes a similar sort of sentiment. What was I going to say? Right. So you think that philosophy as a sort of discipline is in large part related to and sort of continuous with other intellectual disciplines? It's like a separate thing.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. Certainly in many special cases. So it's obvious that, for example, political philosophy, is continuous with political theory. It's obvious that sort of the formal aspects of philosophy, are continuous with the formal sciences. So that people who do, kind of Bayesian probability theory, in philosophy, that's continuous with the people who are doing, Bayesian probability theory, through the various sort of forms. So I mean, I think that's uncontroversial, for some branches of philosophy. I think it should be more widely true of philosophy as a sociological fact than it is.
Right. I think I agree there. The more it seems to get disconnected from the rest of our intellectual disciplines, the more, well, it seems to be irrelevant.
Arrogant, yeah. Yeah.
So let's see. Humble Quest was wondering what view or views related to your areas of focus do you think, if they were changed or overturned or seriously questioned, would have the greatest impact? Not sure how to maybe phrase this question better.
Right. Look, obviously the kind of work that I do on human evolution is framed around, certain, kind of broad consensus views about sort of the time frame over which it's taken place, the environments, over, which it's taken place. So of course you can imagine, that all turning out to be false, that the sort of the record of sort of fossil humans that we have, turns out that the dating is hopelessly wrong, and all of that's happened in the last, 150,000 years rather than 8 million years, or the other way around, that, our ancestors were actually around at the same time as the dinosaurs, so if something like that were, turned out to be true, I'd have to kind of completely rethink, all the kinds of specific ideas I have, about, kind of human, social, and cognitive evolution, what its drivers were, how it worked, and stuff like that.
Or perhaps it all took place in only 6,000 years. Who knows? Maybe.
that would indeed cause me to have to significantly rethink my views.
All right, and I was actually just wondering if you could comment briefly on. So, what are your sort of current projects, and what are you looking forward to working on in the near future?
Okay, so I'll just do one of the current projects, and that'll have to finish us. So, a postdoc and I have currently began a project on sorcery, and the problem is this: over very many, not all cultures, but over very, very many cultures, there's a widespread belief that there are no natural deaths. All deaths, or almost all deaths that we think of as natural, are the result of sorcerous murders. And this is, a belief system that's very destructive. It's very costly. Causes a huge amount of social conflict, has lots of other social costs. Yet it seems to be wide-ranging, prevalent, stable once it arises. All of this, despite the fact that there's, to put it mildly, no good evidence, for these beliefs, and that they're very destructive. So it's basically why, to put it, kind of luridly, why does this form of irrationality arise so regularly, and why is it stable once it arises? If you think of, if you think that, there are kind of rationality building processes, in human cognitive, social, and cultural evolution, this is a sort of real puzzle, and it's a puzzle that I and a postdoc of mine have just started working on.
Sounds great. All right.
You might think the project is a project about human rationality and its limits.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting. We'll end it up around there. Thank you so much for taking the time to engage with us and answer our questions. It's been excellent. It's been enjoyable.
Okay. All right. Okay. Have a good evening. Okay. Bye.